Hello, it's Sonia here from The Pretty Stitch. Welcome to my channel. Today is another Wednesday video and it is the featured stitch of the week. So today what we are going to do is the slip stitch. A slip stitch is used often in the round. You're using it to join your rounds, but it can be a stitch all by itself and you can do a lot of cool things with it. So do the slip stitch. I am using my eye hook or 5.5 millimeter. And if you've never worked extensively in slip stitch, I suggest using a little bit of a larger hook. Just makes it a little bit easier. And I am using worsted weight yarn. And you can certainly use whatever yarn or hook you have, but I do suggest using, I wouldn't suggest using a very lightweight yarn like a lace or sport weight if you've never worked in slip stitch before. It just might be a little bit too difficult. So I would encourage you to definitely use worsted weight, or if you have Aran weight yarn too. It just might make it a little bit easier for you. So to get started, I'm of course going to work my slip knot here. And we will work a chain of 8. So I have my 8 chains right there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to work in the second stitch from my hook, and I am going to work in the back bump. I just find when working slip stitch in a chain, it's a little bit easier to work in the back bump to get started. That's just my preference. You can certainly work in the chain however you wish. So to work a slip stitch, I'm working in the second chain from my hook, pulling up my loop, yarning over, and we're going to pull through both of those loops. So a good rule of thumb is don't work your stitch very tightly. This is one stitch that you want to have a little bit of a relaxed hand when doing it. You don't want to have it super tight. I tend to be a tighter crocheter, so I do have to watch myself a lot when doing this stitch, because if it gets too tight, it's really difficult to work in. So I have one stitch there. I'm going to continue across my chain, my back bump. So I pulled up my loop, yarning over, and just pulling through both of those loops. So it's a little similar to single crochet, but it is slightly different. And again, all of my terms are US terms, not UK, so these are all US terms. So now we have 3 slip stitches on there. Going to work in that back bump again, yarn over, pull through both of those guys, and I'm just going to keep doing it all the way across to the end of my chain. And there's my last bump there. Alright, so we have completed row 1 of our slip stitch. So a lot of times people get confused with this stitch, because if you're looking at it like this, you can see a bunch of loops here. There's just kind of loops all over, so you're not exactly sure where to work for the next row. And usually with slip stitch it's easier because it's a very short, compacted stitch to work in either the back loop or the front loop. And there's different ways of working in those loops. There's also inverse back loop. They believe there's inverse front loop, but it's just how you are putting your hook into the loop. But we're going to concentrate on the front and back loops. And a lot of times slip stitch is worked in the back loop. I tend to do a lot, if I'm working in slip stitch, I tend to do most of it in back loop. I just like the way it looks, but you can certainly play around with the different loops. So we are going to work row 2. So to start row 2, I like to chain 1. You don't necessarily have to. I just find it's a little easier for me. It gives me a little bit of wiggle room there because you're going to turn. So what we're going to do is we will work in the back loop first. So before turning, I find a nice rule of thumb so you know where to work for row 2 is instead of having your work like this, more flat, turn it towards you like this. So the tops of the stitches are facing you. So I have my stitches facing me. So a good way of knowing if you're going to work in the back loops for row 2, if you're not sure, because I've already chained 1, you're going to turn. So now you have it looking at it like this. So now you're like, okay, which one's the back loop, which one's the front loop? It can get a little confusing, especially if you have your work more flat like this. So I do suggest having it turn towards you. So before we turn, a good way to help you out with that is we are going to work in the back loop for row 2. So what I have done, now I'm pretty familiar with the stitch, so I don't do this anymore, but when I was starting out working in slip stitch, I actually used to do this a lot. So here is my work turned towards me, and this is the front loop right here. And I would place a stitch marker in that front loop before turning my work. I'm just using a scrap piece of yarn here. Alright, now I'm going to turn my work. So I have this stitch marker on here, and when you kind of pull at it, see that loop that's popped up there? That is where you want to work. And then you'll just go right to the one next to it here, here, oops, and all the way across. So I'm going to slip stitch across. So right in that guy, I'm going to pull this guy out and work a slip stitch. So that's why I said to not work too tightly, because these can get real tight and it can be tricky finding where your loops are. So for this row, we're going to work in the back loops because slip stitch is often worked in the back loop. But for row 3, we will work in the front loop. Now I really like working slip stitch for ribbing. I think it makes a really nice ribbing, or adds just a little bit of a decorative touch to certain things. It can add a lot of, when you combine slip stitch with other stitches, it can really add a cool texture to it. And I will link some projects below, or some patterns that I've used slip stitch in, incorporating it with other stitches. So now we've worked row 2 in the back loop only. So row 3, I'm going to work in the front loop. So again, I have my work turned towards me like this, and I am going to mark this stitch here with a stitch marker because it's my back loop, but when I turn it, it will turn into my front loop. So that will help me to know where to work row 3. And slip stitch can be tricky, like knitting. When you're knitting, it's really difficult to count rows in knitting. So I suggest, you have a little row counter. Sometimes with knitting, they'll just say work till X amount of inches. So don't get so bogged down on counting the rows, especially with your swatch, or thinking that you have no idea what you're doing because you can't count the rows, because they are difficult to count. They kind of all blend together. So just use a row counter, or you could also, I've used like Post-its and just made little marks for each row so I know, so I don't get lost. You walk away or you don't work on it for a few days and then you have no idea where you are in the pattern. So little notes or row counters can help you out in slip stitch. Other stitches in crochet, it's pretty easy to count the rows. So just wanted to share that a little bit. So row 3, I'm going to chain 1, turn my work. So now I have this stitch marked right here. You can see I'm pulling on it, and we're going to work in the front loop and slip stitch. So you turn your work towards you so you can really see this is the front loop here, there's the back loop there. And this can help you out with other stitches too. If you're working in stitches that are crossed over, it can be hard to count them or to find them when they're just laid flat like this. So when you do have it turned up, you can see the tops of it, and it's a lot easier to know where you are in the pattern, to be able to work the stitches. Just a little tip there. So I am working front loop in my slip stitch here. You could certainly work in both loops in slip stitch, but it is really hard to kind of wiggle your hook into both of those loops. Now, I'm at my last stitch here. A lot of times with slip stitch, your last stitches, they can get a little bit crunched up in there. They can be hard to see. So when you are working in slip stitch, especially like a row of it, you do kind of want to keep track of your stitches. So we want to have 7, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It could be easy to miss this guy, but we know we need to have 7. So, and you can see, you know, she's really crunched up in there. But this is the front loop right here, and I kind of use my finger to help get the hook in there. That's why a pointier hook sometimes helps with this. And now I have completed my 7 rows, or my 7 stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So we'll do another row in back loop. So I'm going to chain 1. I'm going to turn. So I'm just turning it towards me. As I said, I don't really need the stitch markers anymore because I'm pretty familiar with the stitch. And this is also a good way to help you learn to read your work. I'm a believer in reading your work. So what that means is you want to know, you know, what the stitches are supposed to look like. You want to know the components of the stitches, how they're made up. And that helps you to get more familiar with where to place your hook in the stitch. And that just takes time and practice and familiarity. And when you know, just working and practicing these stitches, you'll get better at reading your work, and you'll be able to, you know, sometimes you're just crocheting along and then you're like, you take a good look at your work and you're like, oh, I screwed up. So that's another way of, you know, if you can pick out your mistakes, then you can really read your work well. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we have our 7 stitches in back loop and slip stitch. And now I'm going to chain 1 and turn, and I'm going to work a row of front loop. And as I said before, I do have some projects that I've used slip stitch in, and not just for joining, but to actually, you know, I have a hat I've made. I have quite a few hats that I've used slip stitch in combination with other stitches for ribbing. I do have some ribbing tutorials, which there's some of my first videos, which, you know, they're pretty awful, but I can link those below. If you want to see what slip stitching, you know, ribbing looks like. One of my favorite ribbings is probably slip stitch and maybe like double crochet combined. I think it makes a really nice ribbing. So now we've just completed 1 row of slip stitch in the front loop. And we'll do one more row of back loop, and to keep up with our pattern here. So if you're doing this, you know, try not to use a yarn that splits easily, because that could drive you crazy when doing this stitch, because it is very compact. And you can see why you do want to have a little bit of a looser hand when working this stitch. Okay, so now I've completed another row working in the back loop. So you can see it does make a nice kind of flexible fabric, especially when you are using a very, very large hook. So if you use like a K hook, you know, it does create a nice kind of flexible fabric there. So that is the slip stitch working in front and back loop. So I hope you enjoyed this little stitch of the week here, and thank you so much for watching.